Okay, it's always a great day on the first Tuesday of the month. John King's right over there. Good morning, John.
Hey, good morning, Peter.
And buenos dias to Señor Rob Natelson on the Cinco de Mayo.
Buenos dias, señores. ¿Cómo estáis?
Muy bien, gracias. ¿Dónde está el baño? It's the only thing I ever. The only other
Peter needs another refill. Here's your margarita, Peter.
I try to remember. It was the old Foxtrot cartoon where Roger, the hapless father, gets a cigar and brings it into the house, and his wife says, "You know, that really smells terrible." And and Roger says, "Well, I think it's quite good." And the name of the cigar is Aroma del Baño. and his wife says to him, "Roger, did you ever study Spanish?" And Roger says, "My accent is that good, huh?"
Que bueno. All right, but anyway, good morning, Rob, and welcome once again, sir. It's good to talk with you again.
It's good to be with you.
Yeah, that's right. Rob, we actually have almost every month. Sometimes he takes a journey overseas or something, but which I think you're doing in June, isn't that right?
Yeah, the end of this month, actually. I'm going to Britain for the Magna Carta exhibition.
Wow.
At the British Library. It's the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, and I think that we'll have to postpone our first Tuesday meeting next month, but when I come back, we can talk about Magna Carta and the incredible significance of that document to our heritage.
Well, now, if 50 is golden and 75 is, platinum, what is 600?
You would know. We celebrated it last year.
800. I think it's celestial. I think it's a celestial.
Something like that. I don't know.
Celestial anniversary.
It's the older than dirt anniversary. But anyway.
Well, speaking of, so as you could tell, Rob's an expert in all kinds of antiquities, including the U.S. Constitution, and has written many books. But one of the ones that you should start out on is a little book that he's written called The Original Constitution, What It Actually Said and Meant, which I believe is in its third printing now.
Right, third edition.
And it's in the third edition. You can pick up a copy at Amazon. It's written for the layperson, and it's designed to give a snapshot of the Constitution as it would have been applied in courts in say 1791, right after the Bill of Rights was adopted. I wrote it because there's always a lot of argument back and forth from liberals and conservatives about what the founders intended and so forth. And so I was interested in getting to the bottom of things, and I didn't necessarily agree with the founders on all of my conclusions, but wherever the evidence reached or pointed, that's where I went.
And the really cool thing is it starts in a bar.
That's right, it does start.
It does start in a bar, just like Peter did this morning for Cinco de Mayo.
A tavern with a mug of hot punch.
There you go. That works. All right. So what are we talking about today?
So for the first half hour, I kind of want to focus, since we have this treasure of knowledge here on the air with us today. Rob has recently published an article, I think it's in the Harvard Law Journal, and it has to do with the Origination Clause, which is something that gets bandied about on the airwaves nowadays with this. It's one of the constitutional challenges to the Obamacare Act or the Affordable Care Act. And basically, it's trying to target that idea that if you have a bill that raises revenue, it needs to start in the House. And because this went through the Senate and it changed and they gutted the original bill and changed it, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened really quickly. And then they read about it afterwards, and a lot of people were confused. And now we're going to the Supreme Court to find out if any of it actually works according to the Constitution. Well, Rob has been investigating this and has come to some conclusions. So I was going to have him kind of share those with us during this first half hour. And then at 9, we're going to open up the phones and let you ask your constitutional questions to Rob. So anyway, let's start with the Origination Clause. First of all, Rob, can you just give us a kind of a headline of what the actual clause says and what the import of it is?
Sure. It's Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1, and I will quote it directly. It's not long and it's easy to understand. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. So again, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. Now, when I got started on this project was actually almost 2 years ago now, and I got a grant for investigating whether several lawsuits that challenged Obamacare for on the grounds that that the Senate did not comply with this clause, whether those lawsuits had merit. I don't know by the way, I don't know who the person or entity was that gave the grant. It was anonymous, and I still don't know. But one of the stipulations in it, as with everything I do when investigating original meaning, was that there should be no control over my conclusions. And whatever the conclusions were, based on the evidence I would publish, whether the sponsor liked it or not. And that was agreed to, so I went ahead. The basis of those lawsuits was that Obamacare has a number of taxes, including the penalty for not buying insurance that the Supreme Court has called a tax. It has a number of taxes, and they were actually all created in the Senate, because what the Senate did is it took a House bill on an unrelated subject, gutted that bill, inserted Obamacare in it, then passed it, and then sent it back to the House. So the argument is those taxes really arose in the Senate. And so that would invalidate the law, and that's the basis of the three lawsuits.
Yep.
Well, I investigated this question. I went into a lot of founding era evidence, and it's kind of an exciting journey, and we can talk about it. But the bottom line surprised me and everybody else. It had two aspects. First, I found that the taxes in Obamacare are fine, that there was, in fact, no violation of the Origination Clause in Obamacare because the original bill was a tax bill. It was on a different subject, but it was a tax bill, and the Senate's power to amend included the power to eliminate the taxes in the original bill and put new ones in there. The second aspect was also a surprise, and that is that the things that the Senate added, the provisions the Senate added to appropriate more spending or to regulate the healthcare industry, they went beyond the power of the Senate to amend, and they were the part that was invalid. So, in a nutshell, what I found was kind of the reverse of what these lawsuits claimed. The lawsuits claimed that the taxes were invalid. I found that the taxes in Obamacare were okay, but all the regulations on insurers and providers and individuals, they were the part, along with the appropriations, that actually violated the Origination Clause.
I have a big question for you. When we start, you say that the taxes are okay, but when I read or I hear you read the Constitution there, you use the word amend. Now, amend usually is a slight change or an addendum to something.
There's something has to
Not
be amended.
like to scrape the very words off the page, bleach it, and then throw new ones on there. That seems like a replacement.
You know, that is a great question, and that's one of the things exactly I had to investigate. You know, what is this meaning of this word amendment? The word amendment originally just meant what you said. I mean, it's related to the word to mend, like to mend a garment. And even today we talk about to make amends, you know, to make things better. But what I did is I went into parliamentary records, and I found that an amendment, a permissible amendment, could radically change the tenor of the original bill. Now, the reason I went to the records of the British Parliament is that's where this rule comes from. This is a watered-down version of the rule that was used in Britain. The other thing I did is I went to state legislative records, and I found that the practice of replacing the text of a bill with what is called a complete substitute, which is what was done in Obamacare, that in fact was recognized and done during the founding era in the state legislatures. The only restraint on the amendment process was the same one that really exists in most state legislatures today, which is the amendment had to be relevant to the original purpose of the bill. It had to be germane. Now, according to the way the founders thought of it, every tax change, every tax amendment was germane to a tax bill. But adding regulations or appropriations, that was a different subject entirely.
Okay, now, Rob,
that was beyond being a germane.
I need to ask you to hang on just a second. We're going to continue this discussion here in just a moment, but we need to take a break as we do on Talkback, and we have some stuff to give away.
That's right. We need to amend this section of the Talkback show with a giveaway. We're going to be giving away free coffee and toast with your choice of spreads at the Rocket Coffee Stand, which is in the Garden City Garden Supply right across from the Eastgate Shopping Center at 1000 East Broadway. All you have to do is really easy. You don't have to travel to Europe. You don't have to, be a constitutional scholar or anything like that. All you have to
wear
do
a three-cornered hat or anything.
That's right. Well, if you wear a trifoil hat, I will give you extra credit. Maybe extra sugar for your coffee. 721-1290 is our number. That's all you have to do is call 721-1290, and we'll have free coffee and toast to give away for you.
There we go. We're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is the number. And we're going to be actually holding calls this half hour because we're right in the middle of a very in-depth discussion into the origination clause. So, Rob, if I cut you off, so would you please continue, sir? By the way, congratulations to Joanne, who won the coffee and toast. Go ahead.
That's right, and it's her birthday. So happy birthday, Joanne.
Cinco de Mayo.
May the Cinco de Mayo 5th be with you.
Yes, there you go.
Congratulations and happy birthday, Joanne.
All right, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. We were talking about the origination clause, and I mentioned that I mentioned my finding that that contrary to my expectation, everybody else is that the taxes in Obamacare did not run afoul of this important part of the Constitution, but that the regulations and appropriations did. But doing that required investigating such questions as what is a bill for raising revenue and what is an amendment, as the Constitution uses the term, and what does it mean to originate? And so I spent took a fascinating journey through the documents of founding era legislatures.
Now, when it comes to the U.S. Constitution, obviously you were looking back into the British Parliament and things like that to kind of get your understanding of what the term amendment meant. But is it possible that the founders changed it on purpose to just be an amendment, not to be a rewrite?
They did change it. They did change the practice in the British Parliament. The practice in the British Parliament was just that. It was a practice. It had never really been reduced to one overarching rule. And while everybody understood that tax bills and appropriations had to originate in the House of Commons, not in the House of Lords, there was a lot of argument over the extent to which the House of Lords could fiddle with what was called a money bill. When we declared independence, most of the states wrote their own new constitutions, and several of them either imported what they understood to be the British rule, or they crafted their own origination rules. And we had experience with them, and this experience was partly good and partly bad. And so there was a big fight at the Constitutional Convention over whether to include an origination rule at all, with opponents saying, hey, look, this sort of rule that you can only introduce money bills in the lower house has caused just a lot of, controversy in the states, and the Senate is going to represent the people indirectly, at least, and so there's no reason not to allow the Senate to originate money bills if it wants to. And so ultimately what the founders did is they agreed to a compromise. There's a very famous, at least it's famous among us constitutional wonks, is a famous speech by the great John Dickinson in the Constitutional Convention saying, look, we can't solve this problem all through logic. We've got to look at experience. And experience in Britain with the origination clauses, the origination rule, has been pretty good. And so we need to at least have some version of it. But when they did introduce it into the Constitution, they did water it down a little bit. Just to give you one example, in the British practice, the House of Lords, the upper house, could not amend a money bill at all. But the U.S. Senate can. That's permitted. What they can't do is change the bill completely so that what wasn't a revenue bill is now a revenue bill. And they also can't, just originate a money bill themselves.
Wow.
Or rather a tax bill themselves.
It sounds like they still have quite a bit of leeway, though.
Yes, they have enormous leeway. The problem is in the Obamacare instance, the Senate exceeded even the enormous leeway they have.
Now, that's one thing we haven't really got into. You've talked about what everyone expected to go wrong on this bill, and in fact, what the constitutional arguments in the Supreme Court are about. You've kind of watered down a little bit, or maybe thrown a little water on their fire. What did you find that makes you think that what they did with the Affordable Care Act broke the constitutional process.
And might make it overturnable somehow.
What I found was the definition of amendment. Basically, an amendment allowed one house to change a bill in many ways, change the political thrust of the bill, substitute a new bill for an old bill, but they always had to be on the same subject. And regulations and appropriations were considered a different subject from revenue raising. But let's trace what happened in Obamacare in order to make this a little clearer. First, a bill passes the House. It's called H.R. 3590, and what it says is that there'll be some adjustments in the tax code for the credits that veterans can take when they buy a new home, and also a slight change in the way larger corporations pay taxes. That's what the original bill said. So that passes the House. It goes to the Senate. Okay. Now, at that point, under the constitutional rules, the Senate could change that bill in any way that pertained to revenue or to taxes. They could even gut it entirely and put in a new national sales tax if they wanted to. That would be legitimate amendment. But what the Senate did is they not only put in taxes, new taxes, they also put in a comprehensive scheme of regulation for the healthcare insurance industry, for healthcare providers. They created regulations for employers. They created regulations for individuals. They created new programs and appropriated funds for them. Now, all of that stuff is considered a separate subject from taxes, except for the new taxes itself. So, when, for example, the Senate created the medical equipment tax, which is a tax everybody loves to hate these days, that was constitutionally okay. But when they went ahead and they said employers of more than a certain number of people must offer health insurance, that's a regulation. That wasn't okay.
Sure.
The original bill had nothing to do with regulations.
We're up against a break. We're going to come back and continue talking about this. It's fascinating. 721-1290, and of course, Rob Natelson, our guest. We'll start taking calls for Rob after the 9 o'clock hour after we finish this discussion. We'll continue in a moment. This is Talkback. Just about 2.5 minutes left before we have to take our hard break and head into the top of the hour. We're talking with Rob Natelson, of course, from the Independence Institute about the Origination Clause and the research he's done and the effect that it may have before the Supreme Court.
Right. So first of all, I know sometimes things that you write get taken up by the Supreme Court. They get pulled up, looked at in their decisions. Do you know whether or not this piece has been read by any of the members on the Supreme Court now? And if they do read it, what will their final decision be?
Well, obviously nobody knows the answer to the latter question. The answer to the former question is, I doubt whether Supreme Court justices have looked at it yet, because the case hasn't actually gotten to the Supreme Court yet in any real way. I mean, the people who have brought those cases brought them, as I mentioned, I think on the wrong grounds, and they have been uniformly unsuccessful in the lower courts. I think what would have to happen is somebody would have to say, look, let's start another lawsuit, let's do it right this time, and the case would have to gestate around in the lower courts for a while before it even got to the Supreme Court. My personal hope as a citizen, not as a constitutional lawyer, but my personal hope as a citizen, is that Obamacare is long gone before that, and we never has to go to the Supreme Court.
Okay, in the minute we have remaining, Rob, before we go into the top of the hour, what would it take to basically eliminate Obamacare either constitutionally now?
Well, it would require either a decision by the Supreme Court that some crucial part of Obamacare is unconstitutional, or it would require a president and a Congress committed to repealing it. I think we've already got now a House and a Senate committed to repealing it. We'll see what the results of the election are this coming year. Obamacare took us into very, very treacherous territory, and if it's not repealed, it will guarantee that we are, as American citizens, at each other's throats over issues of health care until the crack of doom. Unless the system can be unraveled and replaced with something better, we're going to be fighting with over health care for the rest of our lives, and we're not going to have health care is good as we should, and people are going to suffer and die as a result of it. So I believe the repeal of this particular mess is absolutely imperative.
Okay, we're going to take it with that. We'll take a quick break. Perfect timing, and we will come back after the top of the hour and start taking your calls at 721-1290. And we are back, and John King is here, and of course joining us from the Independence Institute in Denver, Colorado. Our first Tuesday of the month guest every month is Rob Natelson.
That's right. Thanks for being with us, Rob. Rob is the author of many books, but one that you should pick up if you haven't read any before is the Original Constitution, what it actually said and meant. Now, Rob left the last segment with some fiery language about the future and the Affordable Care Act. And one of our listeners, Sue, wanted to get you to go a little deeper into that. She says, please tell me, what is the treacherous territory the Affordable Care Act is heading us into? My coverage is better now than it was before.
Well, there are winners in the Affordable Care Act. The problem is that they're swamped by losers. And the winners are getting what they're getting at the expense of everybody else. In other words, they're, by and large, getting it unfairly. The treacherous waters are simply this. When you have the government running health care, you have lousy health care. That's what it boils down to. Generations of Canadians have had to travel south of the border to the United States for coverage here that they can't, or for health care here that they can't get in Canada. If there's ever an example of people moving with their feet, that's a great example. Since Obamacare has been adopted, I've noticed several things. Number one, I've noticed that the premiums paid for basic health care by University of Montana employees have jumped substantially. I think they jumped something like 30% in a single year. I also noticed that it's a lot harder to find a doctor. Here in Denver, I've basically lost 2 successive doctors and have had to join what's called a concierge practice. That is to say, a practice where you pay a certain amount each year in order to be able to see a physician. Other people that I know have had the same sort of experience. The system has become extremely clumsy because of the amount of paperwork that is required by Obamacare and the computer programs that are required.
And Rob, if I may throw one statistic in, I just read yesterday, and that is in major cities around the country, whereas Obamacare was supposed to reduce the amount of visits to ERs, the amount of visits to ERs has almost doubled ever since the introduction of Obamacare.
Well, yeah. I mean, take for example my own situation. Okay, because of Obamacare, I lost my family physician. He basically said, I'm not dealing with this. I'm going to concentrate on workers' comp cases, and I'm not doing anything else. Okay, so when I developed severe back pain a little while back, I couldn't call my basic care physician in order to deal with it. Instead, I had to call the emergency room at St. Anthony's Hospital here in Lakewood, Colorado. And I wound up making an emergency room visit that I might not have had to make if I could reach my family physician.
So you're the problem.
Yeah.
I wanted to also point out to Sue.
I'm the problem, right.
I wanted to point out to Sue and anybody that watches Montana politics, this is definitely not just a right-wing view of what's happening with insurance premiums. One of the big debates in the final budget battles in the legislature this session was over how to curb the increasing costs on health insurance for public employees. Both the Republicans and the governor agreed that this was a crucial issue, and they both agreed to scale back on that.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. The phenomenon I'm seeing now is that the diminishing ranks of the defenders of Obamacare are living in a little fantasy world. They'll, like the person who wrote to you a few minutes ago, there will be isolated gainers who from the system who are happy with it, and so they'll tell those stories, or they'll pretend that somehow the wider damage is not being done, or close their minds to the future, to the future damage, and somehow pretend that this is a good thing. I mean, one of the defenders of Obamacare in the last election ran television ads here in the Denver area based on the proposition that it was easier for unmarried young people to get birth control under Obamacare, and therefore it was a good thing. Well, you don't need Obamacare to provide birth control, but more to the point, that is really, frankly, a less important issue than whether people are going to be dying from lack of care, or are going to be suffering the kind of pain that I had to suffer because I no longer had a family physician.
Now, Rob, what I've been getting from people as I bring up Obamacare, they look at me, they kind of cock their heads and say, "You're still talking about that? That's settled law. Let's just move on." I mean, you guys tried dozens and dozens and dozens of times to get it repealed. It's always been vetoed. Why don't you get over it and move on? It's done. We've got it. We got to live with it. Let's make it as good as we can get it and just limp along. So that's what I'm getting.
You know, that kind of argument never applies to the left. I mean, you could just as well have said to the left before Obamacare passed something like this: "Look, we don't have a government system of health care. We have a mixed system of health care. The government spends a lot of money, and it has problems, but we've lived with it for a long time. Get over it. You know, stop trying to radically change the system." We could have said that to the advocates of Obamacare, but if we had, they wouldn't have listened. They just went ahead and do things anyway. I'm concerned about the need to protect people. I'm concerned about the need to ensure that we have the best quality health care that we possibly can have, and that people don't suffer and people don't die. And if we're going to come closer to the kind of world we all would like to be, then we have to recognize that health care is simply too important for the government to run it, and we need to adopt a more freedom-based system.
And we're up against a break, but again, when I say those exact words, the words I get thrown back in my face is, "No, Peter, health care is too important for the government not to run it." So anyway, we're going to come right back. We have Dave on the line. We have one line open. We're starting to take calls for Rob Natelson.
I would advise, there's a state auditor race that's going to be happening this year. One of the candidates for the Democrats is Jesse Laslovich, who's been running and working in that office working in that office as second in command, basically. And he will tell you about the skyrocketing insurance rates that he's been watching happening here in Montana. So whether or not you individually might have seen a decrease in your costs, other people are seeing the opposite. And it's good to find out the truth from a bigger viewpoint, I think.
We're going to come right back and get Dave's call, and we have one line open with Rob Natelson. We'll be right back. It's Talk Back, and it's Tuesday. First Tuesday of the month means Rob Natelson joining us from the Independence Institute there in Denver, Colorado, and we're talking about the Affordable Care Act and the attempts that have been made to try to adjust it or repeal it or overturn it that have been constantly turned away. And now, Rob, would you mind just reacting to what I had said, is that people keep saying, look, just get over it. And not only that, but you had just made a comment that it's far too important for the government to run, and other people have told me it's far more important for the government not to run it.
Well, if the government ran things well, I mean, then North Korea would be the most prosperous nation on earth, right? I mean, we know the difference. Those of us who have experienced both the private sector and the public sector know the difference, okay? I work in the private sector now. The level of efficiency here is far more than I saw when I was working in the public sector. It just is. And you can imagine what would happen if we turned over to the government all of our clothes needs, okay, if we nationalized the clothing industry. First off, the government would make a few sizes. It would be one size fits all. It would make the fashion industry look like the model of flexibility. The price of a shirt would be $650, and $300 of it would be covered with insurance, and so you'd still have to pay do a lot of paperwork and pay $350 for your shirt out of pocket. There would be chronic shortages of clothing, and we would spend an enormous amount of time fighting about who gets what colors and what fits and what styles and where they need to be allocated. The fighting would go on in the newspapers, it would go on in the bureaucracy, it would go on in Congress, et cetera, et cetera. Well, as a society, we've made a decision, thank goodness, that clothes are too important for the government to run. And so as a result, we have clothing. We have a tremendous variety of styles, durability, price levels, preferences, and clothes are I mean, practically nobody goes unclothed for lack of money.
Unless you're in Missoula on an August
thriving
afternoon.
Market. There's also a thriving system of clothes charity.
Right.
I want you to compare that with the kind of mess that the government has made, for example, of health care.
All right, let's get to the phones and say good morning to Dave. Dave, you're on with Rob Natelson. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. About emergency room visits. According to the Wall Street Journal article here, that many doctors don't accept Medicaid patients because the state and federal coverage provides lower reimbursement rates than many private insurers. So that's the reason they're forced to go to the emergency room because doctors won't see them. And if it was a true, fully either all insurance or all government program, it would not run into that problem.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, so does the Washington Post, but it's something that we knew would happen. They are required to see a certain number. There's a capacity level for number of Medicare and Medicaid patients that you see. Oh, they knew that going into the Affordable Care Act.
Certainly.
If I could just add something to this.
Go ahead, Rob.
That situation existed long before Obamacare. A lot of the distortions in the system, a lot of the things that people complained about, the tremendously, but complained about before Obamacare, the high prices, the bureaucracy of the insurance companies, the arrogance of the system, the inflexibility of the system, actually were the result of government intervention. Before the government intervened, federal government intervened into the healthcare system in a big way in the mid-1960s, you didn't really have those phenomena. And you did have, by the way, prior to the 1960s, plans by which medical care bills were taken care of for the poor. But it was certainly very predictable that the kinds of distortions and problems and pain and so forth that were being caused by government intervention of the system before Obamacare would get worse when the government intervened more. What the federal government did when they passed this measure is they doubled down on mistakes they were already making and made them worse. That was obviously not the way to cure the system.
Okay, so Dave, go ahead.
Yes, about the Canadian system. As far as I've read, there is no controversy on Canadian system by the Canadians. They've generally liked their system and are not pushing to change it. Certainly it has faults.
The quick take on the Canadian system is it's a great system if you don't need it. Meaning it's a great system for sort of, if you got some sniffles and you want to go into a clinic and get that taken care of, it's fine. But if you've got something that's out of the box, and this is typical of government programs, if you've got something which is unusual or very serious, you're in trouble. I mean, for example, for many years, and this still may be true, the lack of MRI machines was legendary in Canada. There were very, very few machines, so people regularly had to go to the States. Well, why was that? The relatively freer American system left providers freer to buy MRI machines and to and to provide the services. The other thing about the Canadian system is a system based on what's called global budgeting, meaning that only a certain percentage of GDP may be spent in any year for health care. Now, that's an extraordinarily stupid thing to do, to say, okay, well, this year we're going to spend 9% of GDP on health care, and anyone who spends any more than that, even out of his own money, is a criminal.
Wow.
Do you really want to be in a system where the government bureaucrat says, "I'm sorry, it's really too bad that your kid has a terminal illness and you need a liver transplant right now"? That's really tough. But we were already spent 9% of GDP this year, so your kid can die.
Yeah.
That's the Canadian system.
To Dave's point, though, he's right.
Thanks,
Most
Dave.
Canadians do love their system when they go to the polls.
Yeah.
The same situation exists to a certain extent in Britain. Many people like the British National Health Service. But what is happening in Britain, and to a lesser extent in Canada, is that stresses in the system are resulting in some liberalization. The British system, for example, is no longer a pure government medicine system. It's now a mixed system. But very often the results of those surveys or the results of polling are simply because voters are unaware of the alternatives.
Sure.
When Canada went to a metric system a number of years ago, they stopped teaching the English system of measurement in the schools, and so I'm told that many Canadian kids don't understand what a mile is anymore. They think exclusively in kilometers. Well, if you don't understand what the alternative was, then what really is choice do you think you have?
Okay, we're up against a break, and we have a Facebook comment. Is that right,
That's right,
John?
we do.
Right, so we'll get to that when we come back. Catherine and Eric are both waiting to visit with Rob, and if you can't get through, which often happens, please make your views known on our Facebook page. We'll be right back. All right, we're back on Talkback, and John King is there. I'm Peter Christian. Joining us on the phone, Rob Natelson from the Independence Institute in Denver. We have a Facebook comment.
That's right. This one comes from Claire. She says, if the Supreme Court of the United States decides that the states will define, quote, marriage, end quote, and who will receive benefits from a marriage, would the IRS have to accept the status on 1040s filed by couples residing in the states recognizing same-sex marriage? I think that these are two questions before the court. One, does the 14th Amendment require states to license same-sex marriages? And two, does it require them to recognize those marriages performed in other states? So that's Claire's comment, kind of taking us down the track of the same-sex marriage.
It's a good comment. She accurately phrased the two issues that the court is considering. As to whether the IRS has to recognize what a state does, that's a matter of federal law. The Defense of Marriage Act tried to define marriage as between a man and a woman precisely in order to provide the kind of certainty and uniformity for federal law, irrespective of what the states did, but that was, of course, struck down by the Supreme Court. So it's going to be back to, presumably, once the Supreme Court issues this decision, Congress is going to have to take up the question of definitions under federal law.
Yeah, she also throws in a comment along your clothing analogy a second ago. Claire says, if the government was in charge of the Sahara Desert, there would be a shortage of sand in 3 years.
All right, let's get back to the phone and say good morning to Catherine. Catherine, you're on with Rob. Go ahead.
Good morning. Good morning, Rob.
Hi,
I sent you a link to an article about something that's going on in Wisconsin, and it's in a Fourth Amendment issue. It involves John Doe raids. There are hundreds of subpoenas that were issued by a Kenosha County judge by the name of Barbara Kuka, targeting 29 conservative organizations on supposed campaign violations, campaign finance violations, of which there have been no. There's been no
legal proof.
Yeah, there's been no proof. Anyway, they were targeted with armed pre-dawn raids. They were denied legal representation by the police and the court. They were not allowed to talk about it under the threat of contempt of court charges. And in fact, they are still existing under contempt of court charges with 1 year plus $5,000 per separate act. There's federal civil rights lawsuits now pending against the prosecutors, and the prosecutors are fighting very hard to keep these subpoenas going. So I wanted to see if you would discuss this a little bit, because it's a very scary notion that the Constitution can be twisted around to shut people up and throw them in jail for political positions.
Okay, let's let him answer that. Thanks for the call, Catherine. So go ahead, Rob. What do you think?
Well, I'm not familiar with the particular case, so I can't comment on that. Let me just make two observations generally. Number one, if the prosecutor is targeting conservative organizations, that's not just potentially a Fourth Amendment violation, but a First Amendment violation. I think Catherine said Fourth, and the Fourth would be certainly relevant if there are searches and seizures involved. But there would be a First Amendment violation if they're engaging in selective enforcement. The second thing is, And this is a warning to folks, because I know that this issue of what is called campaign finance reform is really popular in Montana. And I know people love to spew out the word corporation with hatred and to try to bring additional government regulation of corporate expenditures. And, of course, a corporation could be like just a membership corporation like the NAACP. Here's the warning. The deeper you get the state or the federal government into campaign finance and into regulating how people speak and use their money and campaign as part of their First Amendment rights, the more avenues for abuse by the government you open up. It is true that if you don't have campaign finance reform, campaign finance regulations, you can have a lot of people spending money anonymously on elections. But there's an answer to that. The answer to that is, spend more money on the other side, expose them, do investigative work, and so forth. If the government is running the system, the government then has the police power of the state that it can use to persecute political enemies. That is a far more dangerous situation than the situation that you have in the absence of campaign finance laws. So, again, despite the popularity of that particular cause in Montana, I think people need to look very seriously how far they go down that road.
Do you mind if I piggyback off that real quick? What about donations from foreign countries?
What about them?
Well, apparently, U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously against, kind of what we would call free speech for foreign companies that want to invest or foreign entities that want to invest in American politics. Is that something you think the original founders would have thought reasonable?
To be honest, I'm not sure. And I can think of two separate ways of looking at this. Number one, first off, the founders would have said that campaign finance at the federal level is the business of the states. It's not the business of the federal government, period. They would have taken the position that the entire McCain-Feingold law is unconstitutional, that is really a state-type issue, that the very limited power the federal government has to regulate congressional elections does not extend to campaigning. That's point one. Point two, the founders, when they wrote the First Amendment, did not talk about the source of the money. They didn't say that freedom of speech, or actually most of this campaign finance stuff really falls under what the founders would have called freedom of the press. They did not say that freedom of the press depends upon who's doing the printing or who's doing the speaking. So that would argue in favor of allowing foreign interests to speak. On the other hand, the founders believed that the government could and should undertake legislation that restricts the access of foreigners into American markets, including presumably the political market. So I suspect that they probably would have said that Congress could keep foreign campaign dollars out using the Commerce Clause. But again, I'm speculating here. I'm not sure what they would have said about that.
With that, we're up against a break, and Eric and Emmett will get your calls on here momentarily. Sep, we're trying to, I think we have a little bit of a technical difficulty with Rob's phone, so we're going to try to remedy that. We'll come right back after this quick timeout. Okay, rocking with Steely Dan today. That's just had a Jones for that today. All right, Rob Natelson joining us from the Independence Institute. Let's get right back to the phones because I promised we would. And Eric, first of all, thank you for your patience, sir. Go ahead.
Oh, no
How you doing, Eric?
Thank you. Good morning.
What do you have for us today?
This is not my original comment, but Creighton Kearns just did an article on campaign finance and a bill that was going through the Montana Senate, and it makes churches, if they comment on churches in Montana, if they comment on homosexuality or marriage being between a man and a woman, then the people who tithe to the church have to claim that in their taxes. And he was saying that it makes Christians open to persecution, somewhat like having a concealed carry permit and having that exposed by the press, like what happened in New York.
Yeah, well, Eric, it illustrates my point. I mean, the whole area of campaign finance is a very slippery slope. It gets the government into the business of moderating political speech or political press. How much is too much? Is there an adequate balance, et cetera, et cetera? It's really putting the incumbent politicians in charge of their opponents' campaigns.
Yep. And the real reason I called, this might be somewhat pointed, but last month I talked to you, asked a question, and you had said that you were unwilling to discuss theology because you are not a theologian. But, and this goes to Obamacare. As a Jew, you believe the Torah, am I correct?
Yes.
Okay, and in Jewish theology, you're commanded to bind the law to your forehead. And from a Christian perspective, we have a passage that says to bring every thought captive to Christ. And so when you address Obamacare, how would you say that it was wrong without any knowledge of theology or God? How would you address a moral issue apart from your scripture? And I'll leave it with that.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, it's a great question. I think one thing about the Judeo-Christian tradition is the recognition of the dignity of the individual. And this in turn is also picked up by the founder's favorite political philosopher, John Locke. What distinguished Locke from some of his contemporaries, like Hobbes, was that Locke believed that the individual had certain rights that entitled that person to stand against the world, and that even the majority was not morally entitled to take away that person's rights. In other words, if I believe that, I'm not a utilitarian. Now, I also happen to believe that recognizing individual rights is good for everybody too. But if the government decides to take away my property, take away my rights, take away my freedom, and give them to someone else, in most circumstances, that's just really a form of human sacrifice. We know what God said about human sacrifice. It was a practice that was practiced by the non-Jewish people, and it was interdicted, prohibited for the Jewish people. So this isn't always an easy thing to apply, but if you think in terms of, is this really a law which sacrifices the rights and the interests of a few or of some or the politically powerless to the rights and interests of the presumed greater good? That's probably a bad law. I would say probably a bad law because there are circumstances where society has no choice. In the case of national defense, for example, only the federal government can effectively organize national defense. Everybody's got to chip in whether they want to or not. But in the case of divisible goods, like health care, for example, or clothes, an example I mentioned a minute ago, they can be provided through individual initiative in the free market. And for the government to get deeply involved, I think is profoundly immoral.
Okay, with that, we'll take another break. Airman, if you don't mind hanging on, we'll get to you in a moment. We also have a line open. Rob Natelson, only going to be with us for about another 18 minutes or so. So if you have a question about the Constitution, we'd love to have your call at 721-1290. And we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. John King, Peter Christian joining us on the phone from the Independence Institute in Denver is Rob Natelson. So,
okay, one of the things I wanted to get Rob on, and
can we get Emmett's call real quick?
Oh, sure, we can.
I promise we would. Emmett, I don't want to make you wait a minute longer. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much for taking my call. Yeah, I wanted to switch gears back to the gay marriage issue and get Rob's perspective. I've been very disturbed, I think we all have, about the courts overturning the voter-approved bans on same-sex marriage. Every state originally, where there was a voter-approved, do you want same-sex marriage or not, the voters overwhelmingly said, we want marriage to be with a man and a woman, just that. The court said, oh, no, that doesn't count. The will of the people doesn't count. It's unconstitutional. And I believe the courts overturning the gay marriage bans is unconstitutional. It's the tyranny of an oligarchy. And I'm just worried that the Supreme Court, the way things are going and the snowball's been going, is probably just going to say gay marriage is the law of the land in all states. You can't discriminate.
So get over it.
Exactly. And what does Rob think of that? What is Rob's perspective?
Okay, let's get him on. Thanks for the call. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I think it is a state issue. I mean, you're asking me as a constitutional scholar. That is the classic state issue, not federal issue. At the founding, it was specifically identified as a state issue. When the 14th Amendment, which is the part of the Constitution that the plaintiffs in the current case rely upon, when the 14th Amendment was adopted, marriage was understood between a man and a woman. Marriage has always been understood to be a heterosexual relationship. That's been kind of the essence of it everywhere. I think that if the court does decide that that its version of the Constitution mandates the implementation of homosexual marriage everywhere, that there are going to be some very interesting political consequences to that. To say it would be overreach would, I mean, this goes beyond Roe versus Wade in some ways. So, again, as a constitutional matter, I think that's really something for the states to decide.
As a constitutional matter, I wanted to bring up, this is an article that I pulled up. Actually, I pulled it off my Facebook page because a lot of my friends were sharing it. It's an article out of Mother Jones, and the title of it is Ruth Bader Ginsburg Shuts Down Gay Marriage Challengers by an author named Ine O. Anyway, she kind of highlights some of the back and forth that went on at the Supreme Court recently. And
oral arguments, right?
Yes, yeah. And so I wanted to quote some of Ginsburg's comments and get Rob's responses to them. So they basically lay out the article with argument and then response. So I'm going to read the argument, the response. Now, of course, the way that they sum up the argument probably isn't the best way to state the argument, but nonetheless, this is Mother Jones.
It's partisan.
Okay. So the argument, the court does not have any legal right to change a millennia of tradition. And here's Ginsburg's response. Quote, marriage today is not what it was under the common law tradition, under the civil law tradition. Marriage was a relationship of a dominant male to a subordinate female. That ended as a result of this court's decision in 1982, when Louisiana's head and master rule was struck down. What would that be a choice that states should be allowed to have to cling to marriage the way it once was? End quote. So, but Rob, what do you think?
Well, I think that she's confusing one aspect that was sometimes applied to marriage with the essence of the relationship itself. For example, she says that in the civil law tradition, marriage was a relationship in which the man was dominant over the woman. Well, not necessarily. I mean, if you study the High Roman Empire, that is to say about the 2nd, 3rd century, marriage was essentially, unless it was conducted in a particular way, marriage was a very egalitarian issue. There's a lot of institution. There's a lot of commentary from that time about the equal status that women had in marriage with their husbands. So domination is not a necessary part of the institution. The institution's had a lot of things added to it from time to time by different governments in different eras. For example, sometimes there have been racial qualifications attached to it. Sometimes plural marriage has been permitted. But the essence of the institution has always been its heterosexual nature. That has never changed. That's always been the case everywhere. It adheres in the definition. I picked up a copy of my old Unabridged a few months ago, and there it was: marriage, a relationship between husband and wife, man and woman.
What would your answer be?
So what they're asking, what the plaintiffs are asking for, is a fundamental redefinition of a word with established content. And if the Supreme Court can do that, that's actually a little scary.
What would your answer be to her question? Would that be a choice that a state should be allowed to have? How much leeway would you give the states, Rob, or do you think the Constitution gives the states, Rob, on the issue of marriage?
The Equal Protection Clause was passed in order to deal with the issue of race inequality. And while it's by no means limited to race inequality, as the Supreme Court has recognized in other cases, that was the primary focus of those who passed it, and it has always been understood to be more sensitive to race inequality than to some other areas. The court traditionally has recognized that there are biological differences between men and women that that government can recognize, that they're interests of children that government can recognize. So it's an area where I think the court needs to be cautious.
Okay, but
I'm not saying they should never strike down gender-based distinctions, but it's an area where they have to be much more cautious, I think, than, say, in the area of race.
We're going to come right back. We have a 1-minute time out, and we have about 8 minutes left with Rob. If you have a question, get it in now, either on our phone lines, which are open at 721-1290, or on our Facebook page. We're coming right back. And we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. We just have about 8 minutes left in the program. We're in the middle of discussing a thought that Emmett put out, and Rob has been talking about that. Now, off air, we were talking about the redefinition of a word that Rob has mentioned many times, has been extant for thousands of years, and because of the insistence of a very vocal minority, by golly, we're just going to change this. And I was wondering, you said you had a response to that.
Well, yeah, I actually have an article which is very shortly going to be posted at CNS News for those people who want to go to it.
It's actually already up.
Website. It is up?
I'm going to go ahead and link it to our Facebook page so you can see it. And I'll also link the Mother Jones article that I read from earlier.
But to respond specifically to Peter's question, if the justices can redefine a term like that with such established meaning, then we no longer live under a written constitution. We no longer have the rule of law. I recognize, of course, that the justices have from time to time redefined words in the Constitution, but usually that's been the result of ignorance. For example, the First Amendment that they apply isn't quite the same as the Founders' First Amendment, but that's largely because of a failure of historical understanding or historical research. In this case, they are knowingly taking a word and they're redefining it. It actually would be constitutionally preferable to simply strike down all civil marriage laws and to simply say that the state can't venture into this area than to try to actually rewrite those laws or redefine what marriage means.
So when it comes to it, obviously you have different opinion from Ms. Ginsburg. When it comes to it, what do you think the final decision will be? And what do you think the repercussions will be if it goes the way you don't want it to?
If I were a betting man, I would say that's probably going to be 5-4 and 4-5. In other words, probably I would bet that Justice Kennedy is going to be the swing vote and will take the position that states don't have to authorize same-sex marriage themselves, but they have to recognize same-sex marriages from other states. I mean, that sounds like something Justice Kennedy would do, but who knows?
Now,
who knows? And it's quite frankly disturbing that this should even be a who knows type question. To me, this is really a slam dunk constitutional issue, but it's a sign of the times that we live in, that even traditional certainties are open to whatever politically powerful group wants to upend them.
Now, let me ask you this: if a same-sex couple has the right to go to a judge and be united in a civil ceremony, a civil marriage ceremony, and yet there is a pastor or a rabbi or a mullah or whatever in some religious organization that simply says, I'm sorry, I don't care what the government says, I cannot sanction, I cannot oversee this union between you people. You can, just as legal, go to the courthouse and get her done, but please don't ask me to do it. Will they be in violation of the law?
I can foresee a situation in which that would happen. I mean, apparently it has already happened with Catholic hospitals or Catholic institutions in Massachusetts that refuse to recognize same-sex marriage, that they have run themselves into trouble with authority. I supported the repeal of Montana sodomy law. I've always thought this was a matter of private autonomy. But there are some people who do not settle for private autonomy, that they're basically, political totalitarians. And so once they win this, the next step will be to try to marginalize and punish those people who don't agree with them. We're seeing this with the famous Colorado case involving the baker who didn't want to participate in a ceremony that he views as sinful. We could see the time when the next attack will be on churches and synagogues and mosques that refuse to perform same-sex ceremonies.
I guess that perhaps churches will simply have to say, look, in order for me to, or a pastor or a church body, to say we're not going to do this, they have to be willing to give up their tax-exempt status and become a regular organization. Would that give them more power to be able to say no?
It would give them more power, make it obviously harder to survive and to compete against churches that said yes.
Sure.
But if I could just offer a gratuitous comment, as a Jew speaking to Christians.
And we have 2 minutes.
I think Christians need to grow a spine. We're seeing persecution of Christians now all over the world and a coordinated attack on Christianity in this country. And I think it's time for Christians to stand up and fight back, and I'll be with them.
All right. So we have exactly 2 minutes left in the program.
Yes. I guess the Jews probably have some history of being persecuted that you could fall back on their Rob.
We know all about it. Jews know all about it, and that's why the state of Israel takes the position it does. God helps those who help themselves, and the state of Israel puts faith in God, but it also puts faith in the valor of its men and women and its armaments. And the same thing with Christians. They need to put their faith in God, but they also need to put faith in the creativity and the tools that God gave them.
One of the things I brought up earlier was that the idea of foreign governments and foreign entities, and we didn't really get into it, and them donating to political campaigns. One of the things I wanted to bring up was this whole Clinton cash book that comes out tomorrow is tying a lot of threads together. The campaign by the Clintons basically sucking money from overseas donors. Do you think any of that will result in some constitutional issues?
Oh, I doubt it. I don't think that will. There may be legal issues, but I'm told that the book doesn't necessarily itemize legal violations. It just basically demonstrates the hypocrisy of that particular couple.
It all just seems so seamy.
And that hypocrisy is not at all unusual. A number of years ago, I did a radio tape about a woman who was actually a New York consumer advocate. She was always attacking the local utility company, so the local utility company hired her on at a big salary, and that was the end of her. That was the end of her attacks.
Hey, we're out of time, Rob. Folks, tell us how to see more of your articles. Where do we find them?
Sure, constitution.i2i.org. Constitution the letter I, the number 2, the letter I.
Okay.
The letter I, the number 2, the letter I.org.
Have a good day, Rob. Thanks.